The ballroom shimmered under the light of crystal chandeliers. Soft music floated through the air while waiters moved quickly but gracefully, carrying trays filled with drinks and appetizers. The guests wore elegant clothes, men in black suits, women in long gowns that glimmered as they walked. Laughter, polite conversation, and the clinking of glasses filled the space. It was one of those evenings where everything looked perfect from the outside. Among the staff working that night was a young waitress. She moved carefully between tables, making sure every glass was full, every plate placed neatly. She didn't mind the work, it was honest, and she needed it. But as she moved through the room, she couldn't help feeling like she was part of a world that didn't really see her. To most of the guests, she was invisible, just another person in uniform making sure their night went smoothly. Still, she did her job with quiet grace. She smiled when people spoke to her, nodded politely, and never complained. Inside, though, there was a small ache. She used to dream of nights like this, but not from behind a serving tray. She used to dream of being the one on the stage, of being seen and heard. Near the corner of the ballroom stood a grand piano. It was polished until it shone like glass, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers. Every time she passed by it, she felt something stir inside her. Once, long ago, that piano had been her world. She had started playing when she was a child. Her mother used to sit beside her, smiling proudly as her fingers danced across the keys. Music was her first language, her safe place, her dream. But life had a way of changing things. Years ago, her family went through hard times. Her father lost his job and her mother's health began to fail. Bills piled up and she had to make a choice. She left her dream behind to help at home. She took whatever work she could find, cafes, shops, and now this catering job. It wasn't the life she had imagined, but it paid the rent and kept food on the table. Still, every time she saw a piano, she felt the same pull in her chest, the longing for something she once loved deeply. The night went on, the crowd growing livelier as the hours passed. A soft jazz band played in the background, blending perfectly with the laughter and clinking glasses. She moved through the tables, refilling drinks and smiling politely, but her eyes kept finding their way back to that piano in the corner. It stood untouched, waiting like it had something to say. She wondered what it would feel like to play again, even for just a minute, to let her fingers remember the language of sound and emotion. But she pushed the thought aside. This wasn't her place. She was here to serve, not to perform. At one point, she paused near a table of older guests. They were talking about the music, complaining lightly about how quiet it was. "I thought there would be a pianist tonight," one man said. "These events used to have live performances." Another woman nodded. "It feels different without it," she said. "Music makes everything come alive." The waitress smiled politely and moved on, but their words lingered in her mind. Later, during a short break, she stepped outside to catch her breath. The cool night air felt refreshing against her skin. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe. Inside, the music had faded, replaced by the murmur of voices. She could still hear laughter drifting through the doors, but out here it was quiet and she could think. She thought about her life, the long hours, the tired feet, the simple apartment she went home to every night. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't the life she had once imagined. There was a part of her that still believed she was meant for more. Not fame or riches, just something that made her feel alive again. Something that reminded her who she used to be. When she went back inside, the atmosphere had changed slightly. The band had taken a break and the sound of conversation filled the room. The piano still stood there, shining quietly under the lights. She walked past it again, her heart giving a small tug. Her fingers itched, almost instinctively wanting to touch the keys. She imagined sitting down just for a moment, playing something soft, something real. But she quickly shook her head. It wasn't possible. If anyone saw her, she could lose her job. The thought was enough to keep her moving. As the night continued, she worked steadily, her movements practiced and calm. But the piano kept calling to her quietly, persistently. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a memory. Every time she looked at it, she saw her younger self, bright-eyed, hopeful, and full of dreams. The image made her chest tighten. Around midnight, the energy in the room began to slow. Guests leaned back in their chairs, talking softly, sipping the last of their drinks. The lights dimmed slightly, giving everything a golden warmth. The waitress moved to clear a table near the stage area. She could hear the faint hum of the city outside the tall windows. a reminder that the world was still turning beyond these walls. Then something unexpected happened. The event coordinator hurried across the room looking flustered. She was talking quickly to the band members who nodded and began packing up their instruments. The pianist for the evening, it seemed, had canceled last minute, leaving the coordinator frustrated. "We'll just have to play recorded music," someone said. But the idea didn't sit well with her. "No," she replied. "It doesn't feel the same. We need something live." The waitress overheard the conversation while clearing a tray. Her heart began to race. She knew she could play. Every instinct inside her told her to step forward, to say something. But then another thought crept in. What if she wasn't good enough anymore? It had been years since she'd played seriously. Her hands might stumble. Her timing might falter. And what would everyone think? A waitress sitting down to play? They'd laugh. She forced herself to stay quiet and turned away. But the thought refused to fade. It kept growing louder, stronger, until it drowned out her fear. Maybe, she thought, this was her chance. Not for fame, not for applause, but to feel alive again. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from the part of herself she'd left behind. The coordinator walked past again, still muttering about the missing musician. Before she could stop herself, the waitress spoke. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Excuse me," she said. The coordinator turned, surprised. "Yes, I can play," she said quietly. "If you'd like, I could fill in until the musician returns." For a moment, there was silence. The coordinator blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. You play the piano?" The waitress nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she held the tray. "Yes, I've played since I was a child." The woman hesitated. She looked around the room, then back at her. Finally, she sighed. "Well, we don't have many options right now. All right, let's give it a try. Just something soft, okay?" The waitress nodded, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. As she walked toward the piano, she could feel eyes following her. A few guests looked confused. Others whispered quietly to one another. But she didn't look up. She focused on her steps, on the sound of her shoes against the floor, on the weight of the moment pressing around her. When she reached the piano, she hesitated for a second. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished wood. She could see her uniform, her name tag, her slightly tired face. She took a deep breath and sat down. The bench creaked softly under her weight. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, almost shy, but it was real. The sound hung in the air like a memory, delicate and pure. She closed her eyes and let her fingers move. The music came back slowly at first, then stronger, flowing through her like an old friend returning home. The noise of the room faded. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking glasses, all of it disappeared until there was only her, the piano, and the music that had lived inside her all along. For the first time in years, she felt whole again. When the last note faded, the young waitress sat still for a moment. The sound seemed to linger in the air as if the walls themselves were holding on to the melody. It had been so long since she had played that her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from emotion. She felt as if she had unlocked a part of herself she had kept hidden for years. Then, realizing where she was, she quickly stood up and looked around. To her surprise, the room had gone completely quiet. Guests who had been talking and laughing only moments before were now staring at her. Some were smiling softly. Others looked almost stunned. She opened her mouth to apologize, thinking she might have overstepped. But before she could say a word, someone began to clap. Then another joined in, and soon the entire room filled with applause. The sound washed over her, warm and overwhelming. She could hardly believe it. She had just wanted to fill the silence, to offer something small, but the response was more than she ever expected. Her heart swelled with emotion. She bowed her head slightly, not knowing what else to do. The coordinator smiled widely from across the room, giving her a small nod of approval. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a waitress, not as someone struggling to get by, but as someone who had something beautiful to give. It was a feeling she had missed more than she realized. After that, she quietly returned to her work. The guests continued to talk, but the mood in the room had changed. It was softer now, more relaxed. A few people came up to her, thanking her for the music. One man said, "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in a long time." Another guest asked her where she had learned to play. She smiled politely and said, "I used to take lessons when I was younger." That was all she offered, though there was so much more to the story. As the night went on, she played again during small breaks in her serving. Each time the crowd fell quiet, and each time she lost herself a little more in the music. It felt natural, effortless, like breathing. She realized she hadn't just missed the sound of the piano. She had missed what it did to her. The way it made her feel grounded, alive, whole. The connection between her fingers and the keys was something she couldn't explain. It wasn't about the notes. It was about emotion, about saying things she couldn't put into words. When the event ended, several guests approached her as they were leaving. They thanked her again, some even asking if she performed elsewhere. She smiled, shaking her head. "No," she said softly. "I just work here." That answer surprised them, but they all wished her well. One older woman placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't stop playing, dear. The world needs to hear you." Those words stayed with her long after everyone had gone. Later that night, when the room was empty and quiet again, she helped clean up. The other waiters chatted casually, laughing about small things, but she stayed silent, lost in thought. As she wiped down a table near the piano, she paused and looked at it again. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glossy surface of the wood. She ran her hand across the edge of the piano, feeling its smooth texture. It wasn't hers, but it felt like a piece of home. For a moment she imagined what her life might look like if she could play again. Really play, not just in stolen moments. The thought made her chest tighten with both hope and sadness. When her shift finally ended, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and the streets were quiet except for the soft hum of traffic. She walked slowly, her mind still full of music. Every step she took seemed to fall in rhythm with the melodies running through her head. When she reached her small apartment, she unlocked the door, slipped off her shoes, and sat by the window. The city stretched out below her like a sea of lights. She stared at it for a long time, her thoughts drifting between the past and the present. Her apartment was modest. Bare walls, simple furniture, a few photographs from her childhood. But it was hers. In one corner, covered with a cloth, stood a small electric keyboard she had bought years ago from a second-hand shop. It wasn't much, and several of the keys stuck when pressed, but she loved it. She hadn't touched it in months. Now, seeing it there, she felt a sudden urge to play. She walked over, lifted the cover, and sat down. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she pressed down gently, and a faint sound filled the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. She began to play softly, the notes rising and falling in the quiet night. She played until the weight in her chest eased, until her eyes closed, until she forgot how tired she was. When she finally stopped, she smiled to herself. "I can't lose this again," she whispered. Over the next few days, life went on as usual, but something inside her had shifted. She looked forward to work in a way she hadn't before. Each night she hoped she might get a chance to play again, though she didn't expect it. The other staff teased her lightly about her sudden popularity. "You're the star now," one of them said with a grin. She laughed it off, but deep down she felt proud. It wasn't fame she wanted, it was connection. And for a brief moment that night she had felt it. One afternoon she found herself sitting in a small cafe during her break. The smell of coffee filled the air, and a faint tune played from the radio. She sipped her drink slowly, lost in thought. She thought about how easy it was to let dreams fade away, how quickly life could take you in a different direction. She remembered the girl she used to be, the one who would spend hours practicing, who believed music could change lives. That girl still lived somewhere inside her, waiting. She decided then that she wouldn't ignore that part of herself anymore. She might not have much, but she could still play. She could still feel the music, even if it was only for herself. That night she practiced again on her small keyboard, the sound soft and uneven but full of heart. Her neighbors probably heard her through the thin walls, but no one complained. Some nights she even caught herself humming along as she played. Weeks passed and she continued working at events. Sometimes guests would ask her to play, remembering the magical moment from before. Each time she said yes. The fear she once felt had faded, replaced by quiet confidence. The music flowed through her naturally, and every time she played, she noticed how people reacted. Their expressions softened, their voices quieted. It was like the music created a bridge between her and them, one that words couldn't build. One evening, as she finished playing a slow, gentle piece, She noticed a man watching her from across the room. He was older, dressed in a neat suit, and his eyes held a thoughtful look. When she finished, he approached her. "That was beautiful," he said simply. She thanked him, smiling politely. He continued, "I run a small community arts center nearby. We host music nights sometimes. You should come play." The offer surprised her. "Me?" she asked. "I'm not a professional," he smiled kindly. "You don't have to be. You just have to love what you do." His words struck something deep inside her. She took his card, unsure if she would ever call, but she kept it carefully tucked away. The idea of performing again scared her, but it also filled her with hope. Maybe this was what she had been waiting for, a door opening to something new. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The city outside was quiet, and the faint sound of a piano melody played in her head. It was strange how life worked, how one small decision could change everything. Sitting down at that piano during the event had been impulsive, maybe even foolish, but it had reminded her of who she was, and now, for the first time in years, she felt like she had a future worth reaching for. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. She would keep playing, no matter how small the stage, no matter who was listening. She would never let her music fade again, because deep down she knew something true. The moment she stopped playing was the moment she stopped being herself. And she wasn't going to let that happen again. The night had grown warmer as the crowd settled deeper into the evening's rhythm. Soft laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses, and the air smelled of roasted herbs, champagne, and polished wood. The grand ballroom looked like something out of a dream. Tall ceilings draped with golden fabric, a chandelier glowing above, and tables set with crystal and silver. Every corner seemed to whisper wealth. Yet for one waitress moving quietly between the tables, the beauty of the night was mixed with exhaustion. She had been on her feet since early afternoon, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and smiling until her cheeks ached. But she didn't complain. She was used to long hours and the hum of fancy parties where she didn't belong. Still, something about this event felt different. There was a piano sitting near the stage, grand, black, and gleaming beneath the lights. No one had touched it yet, but she noticed how people occasionally looked at it, waiting for someone to begin playing. The organizers had promised live music after dinner, but as time went by, the seat remained empty. She wondered if maybe the pianist was running late or had changed plans. Between her tasks, she found herself glancing at the piano more than once. The sight stirred something deep inside her, a mixture of nostalgia and longing. Years ago, she had spent hours each day sitting at a small upright piano in her parents' living room. She could still remember how it felt to let her fingers dance across the keys, how each note felt like a part of her heart being spoken aloud. But life had a way of taking beautiful things and placing them on distant shelves. When her father became ill, her world shifted, lessons stopped, dreams paused, and eventually she tucked her love for music away, like an old photo album too painful to open. Now, working as a waitress at a lavish event, that part of her felt unreachable. The people she served belonged to a world she only glimpsed through trays and tablecloths. They talked about vacations and investments, while she quietly made sure their glasses never went empty. Yet that night, with the piano standing silent, she couldn't shake a strange feeling, like maybe something was waiting to happen. It was almost 9 when a small commotion began near the stage. The event coordinator, a sharply dressed woman with a clipboard in hand, was speaking hurriedly with the sound technician. The waitress overheard pieces of their conversation while passing by. The pianist apparently was stuck in traffic and might not make it at all. The woman frowned, clearly frustrated. This part of the evening was supposed to be the highlight, a short musical performance before the charity presentation. Without it, the carefully planned mood of the night would fall apart. The waitress hesitated, tray in hand. Her heart started to beat faster as she listened. A quiet, almost reckless thought crossed her mind. Could she offer to play? She immediately pushed the idea away. It was absurd. She was just a server. No one would take her seriously. Still, the thought refused to leave. It was like a small spark refusing to die out, even against the wind of doubt. Minutes passed. The coordinator sighed, rubbing her forehead, whispering something about how embarrassing it would be if they had to skip the music altogether. The waitress swallowed hard, her palms suddenly sweaty. Her mind raced through old memories. Her first recital, thesmil of sheet music, her mother's soft smile as she practiced. She hadn't touched a real piano in years, but the note still lived somewhere inside her. Without fully deciding, she found herself walking toward the stage. Her steps were quiet but firm. When she reached the coordinator, she spoke softly, careful not to sound nervous. "Excuse me," she said, I can play the piano if you'd like." Just until the musician arrives, the woman blinked, surprised. "You can play?" she asked, looking at her uniform, then back at her face. The waitress nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I've been trained. It's been a while, but I could try something simple, just to fill the silence." The coordinator hesitated, torn between skepticism and desperation. Around them, the guests were beginning to murmur, noticing the delay. A few heads turned toward the empty piano. The woman finally sighed. "All right," she said after a pause. "We don't have time to wait, just make it gentle. Something calm." "Of course," the waitress replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She set down her tray on a nearby counter and wiped her hands on her apron. Her heart felt like it was trying to escape her chest. As she walked toward the piano, the world around her seemed to blur. The chatter of the guests, the clinking of glasses. It all faded until there was only the sound of her footsteps on the marble floor. When she reached the piano, she paused. The polished surface reflected her face, flushed and uncertain. She ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the instrument, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood. For a moment, she doubted everything. What if she made a mistake? What if they laughed? But then she remembered how it used to feel when she played, not for others, but for herself. The piano had always been her place of truth, her escape from everything that hurt. Maybe tonight it could be that again. She sat down. The bench creaked softly beneath her. Around her, a few curious guests leaned forward to watch. The coordinator stood at the side, her arms crossed, clearly anxious. The waitress took a deep breath and let her fingers rest on the keys. They felt familiar, like meeting an old friend after years apart. She closed her eyes for a brief second, letting the silence fill her lungs. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost shy. A few heads turned. The sound of the piano spread gently through the room, smooth and fragile at first, then growing richer with each chord. It was a simple melody she remembered from long ago, a piece she used to play whenever she felt uncertain. As her hands found their rhythm, something inside her shifted. The fear melted away, replaced by calm. The notes began to flow as if they had been waiting for this very moment to come alive again. The ballroom slowly quieted. Conversations faded, forks rested on plates. Even the servers paused mid-step. The music filled the space with warmth, soft but powerful, wrapping everyone in its embrace. No one expected it. A waitress playing like that? It was something no one could have planned. Yet there she was, completely absorbed, lost in the language only her heart could speak. The melody grew deeper, more emotional. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was a story. Every note told of dreams once held, sacrifices made, and hopes never fully forgotten. Her hands moved with grace and certainty, as if all the years without practice had never passed. The piano responded, singing with her. It was as though it too had been waiting to be awakened. When the song ended, she lifted her hands slowly, letting the last note linger in the air. For a few long seconds there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence. Then suddenly the room erupted into applause. The guests stood clapping and cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Even the coordinator, who had been biting her lip in worry, was smiling in disbelief. The waitress looked around, dazed. She hadn't expected that. She had only wanted to help, to fill an empty moment. But instead, she had given them something real, something they didn't know they needed. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a server, not as someone blending into the background, but as herself. She stood up from the bench, her heart racing but light. The coordinator approached, eyes wide. "That was incredible," she whispered. "I don't know what to say." The waitress smiled, shyly brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just thought it might help." The applause continued, echoing through the hall. Guests leaned toward each other, asking who she was, how she could play like that, but she didn't stay to answer. She quietly slipped away, back toward the serving area, where her tray still waited. She picked it up, her hands steady now, her heart full. The night carried on, but something had changed. Something in her, and maybe in everyone who heard her play. For the rest of the evening, the piano remained untouched. Its final song, the one she had given it, lingered in the air long after the crowd went home. The sound of applause still echoed in her mind long after it faded from the room. It felt unreal, like a dream she might wake from at any second. The guests had gone back to their seats and conversations began to pick up again, but something in the air had changed. It was softer now, warmer somehow. The performance, brief as it was, had left a mark on everyone, even if they couldn't quite explain why. The waitress returned to her corner, trying to steady her breath. Her hands still tingled from the touch of the piano keys. It had been so long since she had played in front of anyone, and now that she had, it felt like a part of her had come alive again. For years, she'd been a shadow at events like this, serving drinks, smiling politely, blending into the background. But in that one unexpected moment, she had stepped into the light. It both thrilled and frightened her. She continued working quietly, refilling glasses and clearing plates, pretending to ignore the glances that occasionally came her way. Some guests smiled at her, some whispered to each other. A few even clapped softly as she passed, but she only smiled politely and moved on. She wasn't sure how to feel. The last thing she wanted was attention, but deep down, she couldn't deny how good it felt to be heard again. Not for what she served, but for who she was. Later that night, after the main course was served, the event began to settle into its next phase. The charity presentation started, and a speaker took the stage to talk about the foundation's work. The waitress stood near the side, watching as people donated generous amounts of money, their applause filling the room again and again. Yet in her mind she kept returning to the piano, those keys that sound the way her heart had felt when she played. It was like a door had opened inside her, one she had closed a long time ago. When the event finally ended and the guests began to leave, the coordinator approached her. "You did something really special tonight," she said quietly. "You saved us." Everyone loved it. The waitress smiled shyly. "I'm glad I could help," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside her heart still raced. The woman hesitated, then added, "If you ever want to play again, we host smaller events every month." I could talk to my manager. The offer took her by surprise. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "That's kind of you," she replied softly. "I'll think about it." After the guests were gone and the hall began to empty, she stayed behind to help clean up. The lights dimmed and the room grew quiet. Only the soft hum of vacuum cleaners and the clatter of dishes broke the silence. When her shift was nearly done, she walked over to the piano one last time. It stood there quietly, the surface gleaming under the fading lights. She placed her hand on it, feeling the cool smoothness of the wood. The same warmth she had felt earlier stirred inside her again. For years she had believed that part of her life was over, but tonight had reminded her that it wasn't lost. It had only been waiting. As she left the ballroom, she stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights glowed in the distance and a soft breeze brushed her face. She closed her eyes and smiled. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, even if she didn't know what it was yet. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. The memory of the night before replayed in her mind again and again. The music, the crowd, the feeling, it was all still vivid. She had a few hours before her next shift, so she made a cup of coffee and sat by the small window of her apartment. The city outside was already alive with movement, cars passing, people rushing, the hum of morning life. She wondered what those guests from last night were doing now. They'd probably forgotten all about the waitress who played the piano. But she hadn't. She couldn't. She found herself thinking about her old piano at her mother's house, the one she hadn't touched in years. It was small, a bit worn, but it still worked. She used to spend hours there, practicing until the sun went down. The thought of sitting at it again filled her with a strange excitement. She hadn't allowed herself to feel that way in a long time. Maybe, she thought, she could visit it this weekend. When she arrived at work later that day, a few of her co-workers were waiting with knowing smiles. "We heard what happened last night," one of them said. "Everyone's talking about you," she laughed nervously. "Oh, it was nothing. Just filling in, nothing?" another one said. "They said people stood up for you. You have to play for us sometime." She blushed and waved them off. "Maybe one day," she said, trying to sound casual. But inside, the warmth of their words spread quietly. Days turned into weeks, and though life went back to its usual rhythm, something inside her had shifted. Every time she walked past a music store or heard a song playing nearby, She felt that same pull again. One evening, she finally decided to visit her mother. The small piano was still there, covered with a cloth to keep off the dust. When she lifted it, she saw the familiar keys, slightly yellowed but still beautiful. She sat down and pressed one gently. The sound was faint but true. Her fingers trembled at first, unsure, but as she began to play, the old movements came back. Slowly, piece by piece, her confidence returned. Hours passed without her realizing. By the time she stopped, the room was dark except for a single lamp by the window. Her mother stood at the doorway, smiling softly. "You never really forgot, did you?" she said. The waitress shook her head, smiling back. "No," she whispered. "I just stopped believing I could." Her mother walked over and hugged her. "Then maybe it's time to start again." That night, lying in bed, she thought about those words. Maybe it was time. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to let that part of her fade away again. She began to play more often, visiting her mother's house whenever she could. Music filled the small home again like it used to when she was younger. The sound brought comfort, peace, and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as she played softly by herself, her phone buzzed. It was the event coordinator. She had kept her number from the catering company's list. The message was short but kind. "We're hosting another event next month. Would you like to play again? Officially this time." She stared at the message for a long time, her heart pounding. The thought of performing again, not as a replacement but as a musician, both thrilled and scared her. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the piano keys. Then she typed back, "Yes, I'd love to." The following weeks were filled with practice. Every day before or after work, she found time to play. Her neighbors probably heard the music through the thin walls, but no one complained. It became her escape, her joy, her healing. The melody she planned to perform for the next event wasn't one she had ever played publicly before. It was personal, a song that had carried her through her hardest days. She wanted it to speak for her the way words never could. When the night of the next event finally arrived, she felt that same nervous energy in her chest, but this time it was mixed with excitement. The ballroom looked just as beautiful as before, shimmering lights, elegant tables, the hum of conversation. But this time she wasn't serving. She was there as part of the evening's performance. Dressed simply but gracefully, she took her place by the piano, while the host introduced her. Some guests recognized her immediately. Whispers spread across the room. "That's the waitress from last time," she smiled to herself. Maybe she was still a waitress, but tonight she was also something more. As the lights dimmed and the room grew quiet, she took a deep breath. Her fingers found their place on the keys once more, and when she began to play, the sound filled the hall like light breaking through a cloud. It was soft, emotional, and full of life. Each note carried a piece of her story, her struggle, her hope, her rediscovered dream. And as she played, the world around her seemed to disappear again, leaving only the music and the feeling of being free. When the final note faded, the audience rose to their feet once more. The applause washed over her like a wave. But this time she didn't feel nervous or out of place. She smiled, her heart calm. She knew she belonged here, not because someone had allowed her to, but because she had found her way back. For her, the piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a reminder that no dream is ever truly lost, only waiting to be found again. The applause echoed through the ballroom, warm and unending. It rolled across the room like a soft wave, growing louder until it filled every corner. People stood up from their chairs, clapping with genuine joy. For a few seconds, she simply sat there, stunned. Her hands rested on the piano keys and her heart pounded against her ribs. She had played her heart out, and now the world was giving something back. It was more than applause. It was recognition, the kind that reached the deepest part of a person. She finally stood, her knees slightly shaking, and bowed her head. The crowd continued clapping, some smiling, some wiping their eyes. It wasn't a grand concert, just a charity event. But in that moment, it felt like the biggest stage in the world. For her, it wasn't about fame or money. It was about finally being seen. The sound of the applause wasn't just for the music. It was for her courage, her journey, her voice that had been silent for so long. As the crowd began to settle, she looked out at the faces in front of her. People she had once served as a waitress were now looking at her differently. Their eyes held respect, admiration, and something else, wonder. A few guests came forward, shaking her hand, thanking her for the beautiful performance. One older woman took her hand and said softly, "You reminded me what real music feels like." Those words stayed with her. The event coordinator approached her again, smiling from ear to ear. "You were incredible," she said. "I think you stole the entire evening." The waitress laughed nervously. "I just did my best," she said. "I wasn't sure how it would go." "Well," the woman said, "it went perfectly. You have a gift. People were talking about you even during dinner. You should keep doing this." Those words echoed in her mind long after the event ended. As she walked home later that night, the city lights shimmered in puddles on the street. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her thoughts racing. Could she really do this again? Could she go back to music? Not as a memory, but as a path forward. When she got home, she sat by the window and looked out over the city. The world seemed bigger, brighter somehow. She had spent so many years hiding her passion, thinking that it no longer had a place in her life. But tonight had shown her that it wasn't gone. It had only been waiting for her to remember it. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream again. In the following days, her life felt different. At work, her co-workers couldn't stop talking about what had happened. "You're famous now," one of them joked. "You're the piano girl." She laughed, brushing it off. But inside she felt a quiet pride. Even customers who'd been at the event recognized her. Some stopped to thank her. Others asked if she performed anywhere else. She didn't know what to say to that. Performing felt like a distant dream, but the idea was no longer impossible. One afternoon, while she was cleaning up after an event, the coordinator called her over. "You remember that man from the charity board?" she asked. "The one who was sitting in the front row?" "Yes," she said carefully. "He's the director of a small arts foundation. He asked for your contact information. He said he'd like to talk to you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Really? Did he say why?" The coordinator smiled. "He said he hasn't seen that kind of talent in a long time. He wants to help you, maybe give you a chance to perform again. Properly." For a moment, she didn't know what to say. I don't know if I'm ready for that," she admitted. "It's been so long." The woman placed a hand on her shoulder. "You were ready the moment you sat at that piano. Don't doubt yourself now." That night she sat in her small apartment staring at the slip of paper with the man's contact details written neatly across it. She turned it over in her hands, uncertain. What if she failed? What if she wasn't good enough anymore? But then she thought of how the room had felt when she played, how every note had carried a piece of her heart. That feeling couldn't be fake. She took a deep breath and decided to call him the next morning. The man's voice on the phone was kind, warm, and full of enthusiasm. He remembered her performance clearly. "You have something rare," he told her. "You play with honesty. That's what people connect with. I'd like to help you. There's a local concert series next month. Would you be willing to perform?" She hesitated. "I've never performed in anything like that before," she said softly. He chuckled. "You'll do fine. It's not about perfection, it's about emotion. You have plenty of that." They spoke for a few more minutes, and by the end of the call, she had agreed. She would play at the concert. When she hung up, she sat, in silence for a long time, her hands pressed together, her heart both terrified and thrilled. It was happening. Something she had never thought possible was now real. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Every evening after work she practiced, sometimes until midnight, sometimes until dawn. Her neighbors probably heard the faint music through the walls, but no one complained. A few even left little notes on her door saying how much they enjoyed hearing the piano. Those small messages gave her strength. As the concert date approached, nerves began to creep in. What if she forgot the notes? What if the crowd didn't like it? Still, she reminded herself of one thing. She wasn't doing this to impress anyone. She was doing it for the little girl she used to be, Theone, who believed music could change lives. When the night finally came, the theater was filled with a soft hum of voices. It wasn't as grand as the ballroom, but it was beautiful in its own way. Warm lights, velvet seats, and a small stage with a single piano waiting in the center. As she stood backstage, her hands shook slightly. She looked down at them and smiled. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. When her name was announced, she walked out into the light. The applause that greeted her was kind, encouraging. She sat down, took a deep breath, and let her fingers rest on the keys. For a moment, she just listened to the silence around her, the audience waiting, the air still. Then she began to play. The music flowed like water, soft, gentle at first, then rising with emotion. Each note carried a memory, each chord a piece of history. The audience leaned forward, listening closely. She could feel their attention, their connection. It wasn't just performance, it was conversation between her and every soul in the room. Halfway through, she felt tears prick her eyes. She wasn't sad, she was grateful. Every hardship, every sacrifice, every long night had led her here. By the time the final note faded, she felt lighter, freer. The room erupted in applause again, even louder than before. Some people stood, others shouted, "Bravo!" She smiled, unable to stop the tears that finally fell. Afterward, as people came to congratulate her, the man from the foundation approached. "You did it," he said, smiling. "I knew you would." "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing in me." He shook his head. "You just needed a chance. The rest was already inside you." That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years. She looked up at the stars and breathed deeply. Life had taken her on a long, winding road, one full of struggles, sacrifices, and moments of doubt, but it had also brought her back to her truth. The piano wasn't just an instrument, it was a part of her soul, her way of speaking when words weren't enough. From that night on, things began to change. She continued to perform at small venues, sometimes even teaching children who reminded her of herself. Her life wasn't perfect. There were still bills to pay and long shifts to work, but she had found something greater, a reason to keep going. She had rediscovered her purpose. Every time she sat down to play, she remembered that night at the ballroom, the night she was just a waitress who dared to believe again. That single moment had opened a door she thought was closed forever. And as the music filled the air, she knew deep down that sometimes one brave choice can change everything. The weeks after the concert passed in a blur. Life seemed to move at a different rhythm now, a softer and more hopeful one. The waitress, who once blended into the background, was no longer invisible. People at the restaurant whispered about her story, and a few local newspapers even wrote small pieces about the waitress pianist who had stunned a crowd with her talent. She wasn't used to the attention, but she was grateful. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was walking toward something instead of running away from it. Her evenings were now filled with music. Every time she sat at her piano, she felt a deep sense of peace. She practiced old pieces and learned new ones, exploring music that spoke to her heart. She no longer played to impress anyone. She played because it made her feel alive. Her little apartment echoed with melodies, and even her neighbors began to look forward to hearing her play. One morning, she received a letter from the Arts Foundation. Inside was an invitation to perform at a regional music festival. It wasn't a big event, but it was special. It featured rising artists and gave them a chance to connect with professional musicians and producers. At first, she hesitated. The thought of performing for a bigger audience scared her. But then she remembered the words someone had once told her. "You were ready the moment you sat at that piano." That was enough. She decided to do it. The following weeks were filled with preparation. She practiced for hours every day, sometimes losing track of time. Her fingers sagged, but her heart was full. The closer the performance came, the more she felt a mix of fear and excitement. She reminded herself that every great step in her life had started with fear, and this one would be no different. When the day of the festival arrived, she woke up early. The air felt crisp, the kind that hinted at the beginning of autumn. She took the bus to the concert hall, carrying her small bag with sheet music and a bottle of water. As she stepped off the bus, she saw the large building ahead of her. The banner outside read, "Regional Arts Festival Celebrating New Voices." She smiled nervously. This was it. Backstage, other musicians were tuning their instruments, whispering or pacing nervously. She sat quietly in a corner, her hands folded in her lap. When it was finally her turn, she walked onto the stage, her heart pounding. The lights were bright, the audience silent. She took a deep breath, sat at the piano, and closed her eyes for a moment. Then, with steady hands, she began to play. The first few notes came softly, almost like a whisper. Then, as the melody grew, her confidence did too. She played not just with skill, but with emotion. Every note carried a piece of her story, the struggles, the long nights, the moments she almost gave up. By the time she reached the final note, the hall was silent again, the kind of silence that feels heavy with feeling. Then came the applause. It wasn't just polite, it was heartfelt. People stood and clapped, their faces filled with admiration. After the performance, several people approached her backstage. A music teacher told her that her playing had moved him to tears. A young student asked if she gave lessons. Then a woman who introduced herself as a representative from a local recording studio handed her a card. "You have something rare," the woman said. "We'd love to work with you." That night, when she got home, she placed the card on her small kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, she was serving drinks and clearing tables, dreaming silently about music she might never play again. Now people were offering her opportunities she never imagined possible. It was overwhelming, but it was also beautiful. She decided to take things one step at a time. Over the next few months, she began collaborating with the studio. They recorded a few of her performances, simple piano pieces filled with emotion. They weren't perfect, but they were real. The recordings were shared online, and slowly people began to notice. Comments poured in from strangers thanking her for the peace and comfort her music brought them. Some said her songs helped them through hard times. Others simply said they made their days brighter. Reading those words made her smile every time. Her life changed, but she didn't let it change who she was. She still worked part-time at the restaurant, helping her co-workers and greeting guests with the same quiet kindness. Sometimes when customers recognized her, they would ask, "Aren't you the pianist from that video?" She would laugh softly and nod. Fame didn't interest her. What mattered was that her music reached people's hearts. As time passed, she was invited to perform at more events, community gatherings, charity concerts, and even small theaters. Each time she played, she remembered where it had all started. That grand ballroom, the night she had dared to sit at the piano while wearing her waitress uniform. It had been a small act of courage that changed everything. Every note she played now was a reminder of that moment. One day she visited the restaurant where it all began. The event coordinator who had once given her a chance was there. They hugged warmly, both smiling. "You've come a long way," the coordinator said. "I always knew you had something special." The pianist shook her head modestly. "I just needed someone to believe in me," she said. The woman smiled. "And now you're doing the same for others." It was true. She had started teaching piano lessons at a small community center. Her students ranged from young children to older adults who had always wanted to learn but never had the chance. She saw pieces of herself in each of them, the same nervousness, the same spark of hope. Teaching became one of her greatest joys. Watching someone discover the beauty of music reminded her of why she fell in love with it in the first place. Months turned into a year, and her journey continued to unfold in ways she never expected. One afternoon, she received an invitation to perform at a national arts showcase. It was an event that gathered musicians from across the country. It was the biggest opportunity she had ever been offered. The thought terrified her, but she accepted. She knew now that fear was just the beginning of something beautiful. The showcase was held in a grand theater. As she stepped onto the stage, she took a deep breath and smiled. This time she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like she belonged. She played her heart out, her music flowing effortlessly, filling the vast space with warmth and grace. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But what moved her most wasn't the clapping. It was the faces of the people in the crowd. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes, and she knew her music had reached them. After the show, she walked outside and stood under the night sky. The air was cool and the stars shimmered above. She thought about everything that had led her here, the sacrifices, the loneliness, the courage it took to keep going. Every struggle had shaped her into who she was now. She wasn't just a waitress who played piano anymore. She was an artist, a teacher, and most importantly, someone who had found her way back to herself. In the years that followed, she continued to perform, teach, and inspire others. Her story spread beyond her city, becoming a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever given up on a dream. People often asked her how she found the strength to start again. She always answered the same way. Sometimes life pushes you away from what you love, but if it's truly a part of you, it always finds its way back. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was full of music, laughter, and meaning. On quiet nights, she would sit by her piano with a cup of tea, playing softly to herself. The room would fill with the sound of her music, gentle and calm. She no longer played for an audience or applause. She played because it was who she was, and sometimes when she thought back to that lavish event, she smiled. She remembered the way people had looked at her when she first sat at the piano in her waitress uniform. Unsure and trembling, she remembered the silence that followed her first note and the thunder of applause that came after. That was the night she found her courage, her voice, and her future. That was the night everything changed. Her story was never about fame or fortune. It was about rediscovery, about finding beauty in the unexpected, and about believing in second chances. And as the notes drifted softly through her small apartment, she knew that her music would always carry that truth, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, hope can still play the sweetest song.